I never thought the words that would break me most in this world would come from my own child, not from my ex-husband who walked out after 23 years of marriage, not from my so-called best friend who slept with him behind my back, not even from my own mother who told me I wasn't good enough when I was growing up. No, the words that shattered every piece of my heart came from my son Daniel on a cold Tuesday morning in March when he texted me 4 simple sentences that I can still recite from memory. Don't call me anymore. I'm tired of you and your requests. I need space from your drama. Just stop. I stared at those words on my phone screen in my small flat in Manchester, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it, and something inside me didn't just break, it transformed. Because in that moment, sitting alone with my tea going cold on the table, I realized that my 32-year-old son, the boy I had sacrificed everything for, had been poisoned against me, and I knew exactly who was behind it. Let me take you back so you understand how I got here. How a woman who gave up her career, her dreams, her entire identity to raise a child could end up being told to disappear from his life. I was 19 when I had Daniel, barely more than a child myself, but I loved him with a ferocity that surprised even me. His father, Marcus, was 21, charming, ambitious, and utterly convinced he was destined for greatness. We married quickly, too quickly, and I put my university plans on hold to support his career in finance while raising our son. Year after year, I told myself I'd go back to school, finish my degree in architecture, pursue the dreams I'd had since I was a little girl, drawing buildings on napkins. But there was always something more pressing, always another reason to wait. Daniel needed me for his first day of school, then for his football matches, then for his exams, then for university applications. Marcus needed me to host dinners for his colleagues, to maintain the perfect home, to be the perfect wife who made him look good at company events. I became invisible, not just to them, but to myself. When Daniel was 23 and finishing his master's degree in London, Marcus sat me down in our beautiful home in Cheshire, the house I'd decorated and maintained for 2 decades, and told me he was leaving. He'd met someone at work, Jessica, 31 years old, blonde, ambitious, everything I apparently wasn't anymore. He said it so calmly, as if he was discussing a business transaction, telling me I'd grown boring, that I'd let myself go, that we'd grown apart. I was 42 years old and suddenly facing divorce from the only man I'd ever been with, the man I'd built my entire life around. The settlement wasn't generous because Marcus had clever lawyers who somehow made it look like our assets were far less than they actually were. I got the flat in Manchester, a modest monthly amount that barely covered my expenses, and the painful realization that I'd wasted my entire adult life on someone who saw me as disposable. Daniel was upset at first, or so he seemed. He called me weekly, visited once a month, told me he was angry at his father for what he'd done. But slowly, gradually, things changed. Marcus remarried just 8 months after our divorce was finalized, a lavish wedding in the Cotswolds that Daniel attended as best man. Jessica was good at what she did, I'll give her that. She was warm to Daniel, interested in his life, supportive of his career ambitions in ways that seemed genuine. She had money of her own, came from a wealthy family, and suddenly Daniel's life was filled with opportunities I could never have provided. Internships at prestigious firms that Jessica's father arranged, invitations to exclusive events, connections that opened doors I didn't even know existed. And slowly, phone calls became less frequent, visits became rare, and when we did talk, there was a distance in his voice that cut deeper than any words. Then came the requests he mentioned in his text. My heating had broken in January, in the middle of one of the coldest winters Manchester had seen in years, and the repair was going to cost nearly 800 pounds I didn't have. I'd called Daniel, not demanding, just explaining my situation, asking if he could help me out just this once. He'd sighed heavily, that same sigh his father used to make when I asked for anything, and said he'd think about it. 3 days later, 200 pounds appeared in my account with a message. This is all I can spare. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough, and I'd had to borrow from my sister to cover the rest. Then in February, my car failed its MOT and needed nearly 1,000 pounds in repairs. Again, I reached out to Daniel, explaining I needed the car for my part-time job at the local library, the only work I'd managed to find at my age with my limited experience. This time, he sent nothing, just a message saying he had his own expenses and couldn't keep bailing me out. The final request, the one that apparently pushed him over the edge, came 3 weeks before that devastating text. My landlord had informed me he was selling the flat, and I needed to come up with money for a deposit on a new place. I'd asked Daniel if he could loan me 2,000 pounds, money I promised to pay back over time, money that represented the difference between having a home and potentially facing homelessness at 45 years old. That's when everything exploded. He called me instead of texting, and I could hear her in the background. Jessica, her voice syrupy sweet, but with an edge I'd learned to recognize. Daniel told me I needed to stand on my own feet, that I was always asking for money, that I needed to stop relying on him to solve my problems. I tried to explain that these weren't frivolous requests, that I was genuinely struggling, that I'd given up everything to raise him and support his father. That's when he said the words that changed everything. That was your choice, Mom. Nobody forced you to give up your career. Nobody forced you to make your whole life about us. That's not my responsibility. I sat in silence after that phone call, something cold and hard forming in my chest where warmth used to live. And then came that text, 4 sentences that officially ended our relationship, at least the version of it I'd desperately been clinging to. I read those words over and over, and with each reading, the hurt transformed into something else, something sharper, something that demanded action. Because as I sat there in my cold flat, I started remembering things, little details I'd overlooked, patterns I'd been too desperate to notice. I thought about how Jessica always seemed to be around when Daniel and I spoke, how she'd occasionally jump into conversations with little comments about independence and self-sufficiency. I thought about how Marcus had suddenly become more involved in Daniel's life after years of treating him like an inconvenient obligation. I thought about family dinners I wasn't invited to, holidays they took together that I only heard about through Daniel's social media posts, the new dynamic where I was clearly the outsider looking in at the family I'd created. So I did exactly what Daniel asked. I stopped calling. I stopped texting. I vanished from his life so completely it was as if I'd never existed. But unlike what he probably expected, this wasn't surrender. This was strategy. Because I'd spent 23 years being invisible, accommodating, always putting everyone else first. And in that moment of rejection, I realized I'd forgotten the most important person in my life, myself. I had nothing left to lose, which meant I had everything to gain. And if my son wanted space from my drama, I'd give him space. But I'd use that space to rebuild myself in ways that would make him realize exactly what he'd thrown away. The first thing I did was cry for 3 days straight. I let myself feel every ounce of pain, every bit of rejection, every moment of betrayal. I looked at photos of Daniel as a baby, as a toddler taking his first steps, as a young boy grinning gap-toothed in his school uniform. I remembered every sacrifice, every late night, every dream I'd deferred. And then, on the fourth day, I stopped crying. I boxed up every photograph, every memento, every reminder of the life I'd lived for other people, and I stored them in the back of my closet. I didn't throw them away because I'm not cruel, but I removed them from my sight because I needed to see clearly now, and looking at the past was clouding my vision. I started keeping a journal, something I'd never done before, documenting everything. Every interaction I'd had with Marcus, with Jessica, with Daniel over the past few years. Dates, times, conversations, the gradual shift in treatment. I wrote down every financial struggle, every time I'd asked for help, every cold response. I wasn't sure what I'd do with this information yet, but my instinct told me to record everything because patterns reveal truths and truths become power. I also started researching, spending hours in the library where I worked, using my employee access to databases and resources. I looked into Marcus's company, his finances, his new life with Jessica. I looked into parental rights, into divorce settlements, into financial obligations. I educated myself on everything I'd been too tired, too defeated, too busy being convenient to learn before. 3 weeks after Daniel's text, my phone rang. It was him. I stared at his name on the screen, my heart hammering in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to answer, to hear his voice, to make everything okay again like I'd always done. But I remembered his words, his cruelty, his dismissal of everything I'd sacrificed. I let it ring through to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. 2 days later, he called again. Again, I didn't answer. Then came a text. "Mom, just checking you're okay. Call me when you can." The casual tone infuriated me, as if his devastating message had never happened, as if he could just pop back into my life when it was convenient for him. I deleted the text without responding. This happened 4 more times over the next month, calls and texts that I ignored with increasing ease, each one making me stronger, more resolved. During this time, I threw myself into transformation. I'd been working part-time at the library for minimum wage, feeling grateful just to have any job at my age with my limited experience. But I started taking every available shift, volunteering for projects, teaching myself new systems. The head librarian, Margaret, a woman in her 60s who'd watched me arrive broken and defeated 2 years earlier, noticed the change. She pulled me aside one afternoon and told me about a full-time position opening up, a role coordinating community programs that paid significantly better and included benefits. She encouraged me to apply, said she'd seen something spark in me recently, a determination that hadn't been there before. I applied that same day, and to my shock, I got it. It wasn't much, not compared to what I could have been earning if I'd finished my degree all those years ago, but it was mine, earned by me through my own effort. With the increased income and stability, I started putting aside money each month, small amounts at first, but they added up. I also contacted a solicitor, using a free initial consultation to discuss my divorce settlement. I explained everything, how Marcus's lawyers had somehow made his assets appear minimal, how I'd been too exhausted and defeated to fight at the time. The solicitor, a sharp woman named Patricia, who reminded me of who I might have become in another life, listened carefully and said something interesting. She told me that if Marcus had hidden assets or misrepresented his financial situation during the divorce, I might have grounds to reopen the settlement. She couldn't promise anything without a proper investigation, but her eyes told me she suspected what I was beginning to understand. I'd been cheated in more ways than one. I couldn't afford Patricia's full services, not yet, but she gave me advice on what to look for, how to document things, what questions to ask. She also mentioned that parental alienation, while difficult to prove, was being taken more seriously in UK courts, especially when one parent systematically turned a child against the other. I filed away that information too, adding it to my growing arsenal of knowledge, because that's what I was building, an arsenal, not of weapons that would destroy, but of truths that would expose, of facts that would speak louder than any emotional appeal ever could. By June, 3 months after Daniel's text, I'd transformed my life in ways I couldn't have imagined. I'd lost weight, not through deliberate dieting, but because I was moving more, stressing less, living for myself. I'd updated my wardrobe with charity shop finds that actually fit my personality rather than the drab, invisible clothes I'd hidden in for years. I'd started taking evening classes in architectural history at the local college, reconnecting with the passion I'd abandoned decades ago. My tiny flat, the one I'd been so desperate to keep, became my sanctuary. I painted the walls in colors I loved, hung art that spoke to me, created a space that reflected who I was becoming rather than who I'd been forced to be. I also started building a new social circle. For years, my entire world had revolved around Marcus, Daniel, and the few wives of Marcus's colleagues who tolerated me at company events. Now I joined a book club, started attending community events at the library, made friends with people who knew nothing about my past, who met me as Sarah, the woman I was now, not Sarah, the discarded wife and rejected mother. There was something liberating about being anonymous, about crafting a new identity based on my own choices rather than other people's needs. And through these new connections, I started hearing stories. Other women who'd been cast aside, other mothers whose children had been turned against them, other wives who'd sacrificed everything only to be told they'd sacrificed nothing. In July, Daniel showed up at my flat unannounced. I was getting ready for my book club when the buzzer rang and his voice came through the intercom, uncertain, almost nervous. "Mom, it's me. Can I come up? I've been worried about you." Every instinct I'd developed over 32 years of motherhood screamed at me to buzz him in immediately, to make tea, to smooth everything over, to be grateful he'd come back. But I'd spent 4 months rebuilding myself, and I wasn't ready to let him tear that down with a simple visit. I pressed the button and said calmly, clearly, "I'm actually on my way out. This isn't a good time." The silence that followed told me everything. He wasn't used to being told no by me, wasn't prepared for a mother who had plans that didn't revolve around him. "Mom, please, I just want to talk." His voice had that edge of frustration I recognized, the same tone he used when I wasn't being convenient enough. I could have caved. Part of me desperately wanted to, but I thought about that text, about those 4 sentences, about every time I'd asked for help and been made to feel like a burden. I pressed the button again. I said, "It's not a good time, Daniel. If you want to talk, you can call and schedule something." I released the button before he could respond, grabbed my bag, and left through the back entrance of the building, my hands shaking, but my resolve solid. I cried during book club that night, excusing myself to the bathroom twice to compose myself. But I didn't regret my choice, because for the first time in my life, I put my own boundaries first, and it felt terrifying and empowering in equal measure. Daniel texted the next day. "I don't understand what's going on with you. You're acting strange. Dad and Jessica are worried too." That message told me everything I needed to know. He'd gone straight to them, discussed my behavior, my rejection of his unexpected visit. They were presenting a united front, painting me as the problem, the strange one, the difficult mother who wasn't playing her part anymore. I screenshot the message, added it to my growing documentation, and responded simply, You asked me to stop calling. I'm respecting your wishes. Have a good life, Daniel. His response came within minutes. That's not what I meant, and you know it. Why are you being like this? I didn't respond. Let him wonder. Let him question. Let him feel an ounce of the confusion and hurt he'd inflicted on me. Through my new social circles, I met a woman named Helen who worked in finance at a firm that, through conversation, I realized had business dealings with Marcus's company. We became friends naturally, bonding over our shared love of historical architecture and our mutual experience of divorce. I never pushed for information, never revealed the connection, but Helen was a talker, someone who loved gossip and insider knowledge. Over coffee one afternoon in August, she mentioned a potential merger her firm was negotiating, one that involved Marcus's company. She talked about due diligence, about financial audits, about how these processes often revealed discrepancies that had been hidden for years. I listened, asked casual questions, learned how these investigations worked, what they uncovered, how information flowed. I also reconnected with my sister, Linda, who I drifted away from during my marriage because Marcus never liked her, said she was too opinionated, too feminist, too much of a bad influence. Linda was a solicitor herself, specializing in employment law, but she knew people across various legal fields. When I finally told her everything that had happened, she was furious on my behalf, angry that I'd suffered alone for so long, determined to help however she could. She connected me with Patricia again, this time offering to cover some of the costs of investigating my divorce settlement, calling it a loan that I could pay back when I was able. She also said something that stuck with me. The best revenge isn't destruction, Sarah. It's living so well that they realize what they lost. By September, Patricia's investigation was revealing cracks in Marcus's financial disclosure during our divorce. There were accounts he hadn't mentioned, investments hidden under Jessica's name that had existed before their marriage, business dealings that suggested his assets had been far more substantial than he'd claimed. None of it was definitively fraudulent yet, but it smelled wrong, and Patricia was good at following sense. She filed preliminary motions to reopen the financial aspects of the divorce, claiming material non-disclosure. Marcus would receive notification soon, and I found myself feeling nothing but calm anticipation. No anger, no bitterness, just cold, calculated patience. Daniel called 3 times that week. I didn't answer. He texted, "Mom, Dad said you're causing problems. What's going on? Can we please talk?" I almost laughed at the audacity. Of course Marcus had told him, probably painting me as vindictive, as greedy, as unstable. Of course Daniel believed him without question, without ever considering that maybe, just maybe, his perfect father wasn't who he pretended to be. I responded, "Legal matters between your father and me have nothing to do with you. Don't worry about it." His response was immediate. "How can I not worry? You're my mother. This is affecting our family." Our family. The irony was exquisite. I wrote back, "You told me to stop calling, to leave you alone. I'm simply handling my own affairs now, which is what you wanted. Have a good evening." October brought the first real confrontation. Marcus called me directly, the first time I'd heard his voice in nearly 2 years. He was angry, that controlled corporate anger he wielded like a weapon. "Sarah, what the hell do you think you're doing? This investigation is harassment. You got your settlement, it was fair, and now you're trying to milk me for more." I let him talk, let him vent, listening calmly while I stirred sugar into my tea. When he finally paused for breath, I said quietly, "If the settlement was fair, Marcus, then the investigation will show that, won't it? You have nothing to worry about if you were honest." I could hear his frustration building. I was honest. This is just you being bitter and vindictive. And you're upsetting Daniel with all this nonsense. That's when my voice got colder. Daniel told me not to call him anymore, told me he was tired of me and my requests. So how is this upsetting him? I'm simply handling my own legal matters, which have nothing to do with our son. Marcus was silent for a moment, and I knew he was recalculating, realizing I wasn't the broken woman he'd left. Sarah, let's be reasonable here. If you drop this investigation, I'm sure we can work something out, maybe an additional monthly payment, help with your expenses. I smiled, though he couldn't see it. I don't want your charity, Marcus. I want what was rightfully mine from the start, and I'm going to get it one way or another. I hung up before he could respond, my hands shaking, but my resolve absolute. He called back twice. I didn't answer. He texted, "You're making a mistake. This will blow up in your face." I blocked his number and poured myself a glass of wine. That evening, Daniel showed up at my flat again, this time clearly agitated. I was home, had nowhere to escape to, so I buzzed him in. When I opened the door, he looked different, older somehow, stressed in ways I'd never seen before. "Mom, we need to talk about what you're doing to Dad." I stepped aside to let him in, noting that there was no greeting, no hug, no inquiry about my well-being, just immediate defense of his father. I gestured to the sofa, but I remained standing. "Would you like tea?" He shook his head impatiently. "I don't want tea. I want to understand why you're dragging Dad through this legal nightmare. He said you're making false accusations about the divorce settlement." I sat down across from him, studied his face, saw so much of Marcus in his expressions, in the way he held himself. "Daniel, did your father hide assets during our divorce?" He blinked, surprised by the direct question. "Of course not. Why would he do that?" I leaned forward. "Then he has nothing to worry about. The investigation will clear him completely." Daniel ran his hands through his hair, frustrated. "But it's stressful for him, for Jessica, for their life together. It's like you're trying to punish them for being happy." The words hit exactly as he intended, but I'd spent months preparing for this moment. "Is that what they told you, that I'm bitter about their happiness?" He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Mom, come on. You have to admit the timing is suspicious. Right after Dad remarried, started building a new life, you suddenly decide the settlement was unfair." I stood up, walked to my small desk, pulled out a folder I'd been building. I handed it to Daniel. "Before you defend him further, look at this. These are documents from the divorce, showing what your father claimed he had. These are records I've found since then, showing accounts, investments, properties that existed during our marriage that he never disclosed. I'm not making false accusations, Daniel. I'm simply asking for the truth." He took the folder reluctantly, flipped through pages without really reading them. "Where did you even get all this?" I smiled tightly. "I may have spent 23 years being your father's convenient wife, but I'm not stupid. I just never had reason to look before." Daniel set the folder down, wouldn't meet my eyes. "Even if this is all true, even if Dad made some mistakes in the disclosure, dragging him through court seems extreme. Can't you just talk to him, work something out privately?" I sat back down, felt the weight of months of transformation, of rebuilding, of becoming someone who wouldn't compromise anymore. "Your father called me today, offered me additional monthly payments if I dropped the investigation. Do you know what that tells me, Daniel? That he knows he did something wrong. Innocent people don't try to buy silence." Daniel stood up abruptly. "This isn't you, Mum. You're not vindictive. You're not cruel. Someone's put these ideas in your head, made you think Dad cheated you, did." That's when something in me snapped, not into anger, but into absolute clarity. "You want to know what's cruel, Daniel? Telling your mother, who raised you alone because your father was too busy with his career, who sacrificed her own dreams so you could have yours, who gave up everything to make sure you had the best life possible, to stop calling because you're tired of her requests, requesting help when I'm about to be homeless, when I can't afford heating in winter, when I need basic repairs, isn't drama, Daniel. It's survival. And I asked you for help maybe 3 times in 2 years, 3 times after a lifetime of putting you first. So don't you dare tell me I'm being cruel now. His face went pale, and for a moment I saw conflict in his eyes, saw the boy I'd raised fighting with the man they'd shaped. But then he shook his head, and I watched him choose them over me. That text was harsh, I admit that, but you have to understand, you were constantly asking for money, making me feel guilty, bringing up everything you'd sacrificed like I owed you something. Jessica helped me see that I needed boundaries, that your dependence wasn't healthy. There it was, finally spoken aloud. Jessica, the puppet master, pulling strings I'd sensed but never confirmed. Jessica, I repeated, tasting the name like poison. Your father's mistress, the woman he was sleeping with while still married to me, has been giving you advice about healthy boundaries with your mother? Daniel's jaw tightened. She wasn't his mistress. They met after the separation. I laughed, a harsh sound that surprised us both. Is that what they told you? Daniel, your father admitted to me during the divorce that he'd been seeing Jessica for 8 months before he left. 8 months of lying, of sneaking around, of betraying 23 years of marriage. But sure, let's pretend she's some innocent party who just happened to appear after we separated. He shook his head stubbornly. You're twisting things. Dad said you tried to turn me against Jessica. I stood up, opened the door. I'm not trying to turn you against anyone, but I'm also done being painted as the villain in a story where I'm actually the victim. If you want to believe their version, that's your choice. But don't come to my home defending people who systematically destroyed me and then lecture me about cruelty. Daniel stared at me, this stranger wearing his mother's face, and I could see he didn't know how to process who I'd become. You've changed, he said finally, and it sounded like an accusation. I nodded. Yes, I have. I had to because the person I was got crushed by people she loved. The person I am now won't be crushed by anyone. He walked to the door, paused. Are you really going to go through with this? Sue Dad? Drag our family through court? Make everything public? I met his eyes without flinching. I'm going to get what I'm owed, yes. What happens in court depends on your father's choices now. If he was honest, he has nothing to fear. If he wasn't, well, that's on him. Daniel left without another word, and I closed the door behind him, leaned against it, and cried for the last time over my son, because I knew then that I'd lost him, really lost him, not to distance or misunderstanding, but to deliberate poisoning, to systematic manipulation, to a father and stepmother who'd spent years crafting a narrative where I was the problem. And while that hurt more than anything, I also knew I couldn't save someone who didn't want to be saved, couldn't fight for someone who'd chosen his enemy's side. November brought developments faster than I'd expected. Patricia's investigation had uncovered enough evidence of financial non-disclosure that the court agreed to a formal audit of Marcus's assets during the time of our divorce. This meant accountants going through everything, comparing what he'd claimed with what actually existed. Marcus had to provide documentation, bank statements, investment records, everything. And with each layer they peeled back, more discrepancies appeared. An investment property in Spain purchased in Jessica's name, but funded by Marcus 2 months before our divorce. A business partnership in her father's company that predated their supposed meeting. Accounts under his mother's name that showed regular transfers from Marcus's business. The most damaging discovery came in December. Patricia found emails, recovered through legal discovery processes I didn't fully understand, between Marcus and Jessica discussing how to protect assets before the divorce. They were careful, never explicitly saying they were hiding money, but the implication was clear: moving investments, restructuring ownership, timing purchases to minimize what would be considered marital assets. Jessica, with her finance background and wealthy family, had helped Marcus systematically reduce his apparent worth before the divorce proceedings. It wasn't just betrayal, it was calculated fraud, and Patricia said we had a strong case not just to reopen the settlement, but to potentially pursue criminal charges. I should have felt vindicated, victorious even. But mostly I felt tired, sad that it had come to this, that the man I'd loved for over 2 decades had cared so little about me that he'd stolen from me while destroying our marriage. Linda was thrilled, kept calling it justice, kept talking about how much I was owed, but I realized I didn't want Marcus's money for revenge anymore. I wanted it for freedom, for the ability to finish my education, to pursue the career I'd abandoned, to build a life that wasn't defined by anyone's expectations but my own. Daniel called me on December 15th, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Are you happy now? Dad might lose everything because of your vindictive crusade. His business is under investigation. His reputation is destroyed. Jessica's family is furious, and it's all because you couldn't let go." I let him talk, let him rage, and when he finally ran out of steam, I said quietly, "Your father stole from me, Daniel. Stole money that I was entitled to. Money that would have kept me from struggling, from having to beg my own son for help. He committed fraud, and now he's facing consequences. That's not vindictiveness. That's justice." "Justice?" Daniel's voice cracked. "You're destroying his life over money. You're tearing apart our family over greed." I closed my eyes, felt the weight of everything that had brought us here. "I asked you 3 times for help over 2 years, Daniel. 3 times. And you made me feel like a burden, like an inconvenience, like I was taking advantage of you. Do you know why I needed to ask? Because your father made sure I got as little as possible in the divorce so he could build his new life with Jessica. Every struggle I've had, every cold night, every moment of financial panic stems from his deliberate theft. So don't talk to me about destroying lives. My life was destroyed years ago, and nobody cared then." "That's not fair," he said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "You could have fought harder during the divorce. You could have gotten a better lawyer. You didn't have to just accept whatever Dad's lawyers offered." I laughed bitterly. I was broken, Daniel, absolutely shattered. 23 years of marriage ended because your father fell for someone younger and richer, and I had nothing left to fight with. I had no career, no savings of my own, no support system because I dedicated everything to you and him. So yes, I accepted what they gave me because I didn't know I had any other choice. But I know now, and I'm making different choices. There was a long silence, and I could hear voices in the background, Jessica's distinct tone saying something I couldn't make out. When Daniel spoke again, his voice was colder, more formal. "Jessica says I should tell you that if you continue this legal action, we'll have no choice but to cut ties completely. Dad can't have this stress in his life, and I can't watch you destroy him. So you need to choose, Mom. Drop this case, accept a reasonable settlement, and we can try to rebuild our relationship, or continue down this path and lose me forever." The ultimatum hung in the air between us, and I realized this was the moment everything had been leading to, the moment where I chose myself or chose the scraps of a relationship that had already been destroyed. "Daniel," I said slowly, "that's not a real choice, and you know it. You're asking me to let your father get away with fraud, to accept less than I'm owed, to be grateful for crumbs. Also, I can maintain a relationship with a son who's already made clear I'm a burden to him. That's not love, that's manipulation, and I'm done being manipulated. So that's it, he said, and I could hear the finality in his voice. You're choosing money over your son? I felt tears sliding down my face, but my voice remained steady. I'm choosing me, Daniel. For the first time in my entire life, I'm choosing what's right for me instead of what's convenient for everyone else. If that means losing you, then I've already lost you, because the son I raised wouldn't force me to make this choice. I heard him take a shaky breath. Goodbye, Mom. The line went dead, and I sat in my flat, holding my phone, feeling the weight of that goodbye settle into my bones. Christmas came and went in a blur. I spent it with Linda and her family, welcomed into their warmth, their laughter, their acceptance. Linda's husband, Tom, said something that Christmas afternoon that stuck with me. He said, "The people who truly love you never make you choose between your well-being and their approval. That's not love, Sarah. That's control." I thought about those words constantly as the new year approached, as Patricia prepared for the final hearings, as my transformed life continued to unfold in ways I'd never imagined. January brought the settlement hearing. Marcus and Jessica attended with their expensive lawyers, sitting across the courtroom looking like victims rather than perpetrators. Daniel was there too, sitting behind them, his face carefully neutral, but his eyes avoiding mine. The evidence was presented methodically, professionally. The hidden accounts, the transferred assets, the emails discussing asset protection, the timeline of deception. Marcus's lawyers tried to argue that everything was a misunderstanding, that the asset transfers were legitimate business decisions, that Jessica's involvement was innocent. But Patricia was brilliant, connecting dots, showing patterns, demonstrating clear intent to defraud. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s who'd probably seen every trick in the divorce book, wasn't impressed by Marcus's excuses. She called the evidence compelling, the pattern of behavior troubling, and the original settlement grossly inequitable given the undisclosed assets. She ordered a complete restructuring of the divorce settlement, awarding me 58% of the marital assets instead of the 20% I'd originally received. The amount was substantial, life-changing, enough to provide security I'd never known. She also ordered Marcus to pay all legal fees and fined him for deliberate non-disclosure. But most satisfying was her final comment, delivered while looking directly at Marcus. Marriage is a partnership built on trust. Divorce proceedings require honesty. You violated both. The consequences you face now are entirely of your own making. I watched Marcus's face crumble, watched Jessica grip his hand, her perfect facade cracking. I watched Daniel's confusion, his inability to process what had just happened, and I felt nothing but calm. Not joy, not victory, just peace. Because this wasn't about revenge anymore, hadn't been for months. This was about justice, about truth, about reclaiming what had been stolen, not just financially, but emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. Outside the courthouse, Daniel approached me while Marcus and Jessica dealt with their lawyers. He looked younger somehow, uncertain, the confidence that had defined our last interactions completely gone. "Mom," he started, then stopped, seemed to struggle with what to say. I waited, didn't help him, didn't make this easier. "I didn't know," he finally said, "about the money, about what Dad did. I really didn't know." I studied his face, tried to find the boy I'd raised in this man I barely recognized. "Would it have mattered?" I asked quietly. "If you'd known the truth, would you have believed me, or would you have believed them?" He flinched, and I had my answer. Jessica told me you were bitter, that you couldn't accept Dad's happiness, that you were making up lies to hurt him. I believed her because, I don't know, she seemed to have my best interests at heart. She helped me with my career, introduced me to important people, treated me like family. I nodded slowly. She treated you well because she was erasing me, Daniel. Every kindness to you was a nail in the coffin of our relationship, and it worked perfectly, didn't it? She turned you against me without you even realizing it was happening. I'm sorry, he said, and tears filled his eyes. I'm so sorry, Mom. I said terrible things. I abandoned you when you needed me. I believed their lies without questioning. I don't know how to make this right. I felt my own tears threatening, but I held them back. You can't make it right, Daniel. Not immediately. Words are easy. Actions matter. You made your choice, sided with them, delivered ultimatums, threatened to cut me off. Those weren't just mistakes. Those were deliberate cruelties. And I forgive you, truly I do, because I understand how manipulation works. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean returning to how things were. What does it mean then? He asked desperately. I touched his arm gently, the first physical contact we'd had in nearly a year. It means maybe someday we can build something new, but it can't be built on me sacrificing myself for your comfort. It can't be built on me being convenient and invisible. It has to be built on mutual respect, on you seeing me as a whole person with my own needs and value, not just as Mom who exists to serve everyone else. And that takes time, Daniel. Lots of time. He nodded, wiping his eyes. Can I call you? Not right away. I understand if you need space. But eventually, I smiled sadly. You can call, but know that I might not always answer. Not to punish you, but because I have my own life now, my own plans, my own priorities. The woman who dropped everything for you doesn't exist anymore. She had to die so I could live. I walked away then, left him standing outside the courthouse, and I didn't look back, because looking back keeps you trapped in the past, and I was finally completely focused on moving forward. The months that followed were transformative in ways I'm still processing. The settlement money allowed me to finally return to university at 46 years old, pursuing my long-abandoned degree in architecture. I was the oldest student in most classes, but also the most determined. Professors remarked on my passion, my unique perspective, my ability to blend classical understanding with modern innovation. I thrived in ways I'd never allowed myself to before, discovering that my brain hadn't atrophied during all those years of domestic service. It had just been dormant, waiting for permission to wake up. I moved from my small Manchester flat to a modest but beautiful cottage on the outskirts of the city, a place with character and history that I restored with my own hands and emerging architectural knowledge. I adopted a rescue dog, a scruffy terrier named Archie, who'd been abandoned and mistreated but still had love to give. We healed together, two damaged souls learning to trust again. I traveled, not extravagantly, but meaningfully, visiting architectural sites I dreamed about for decades. I stood in front of buildings I'd only seen in textbooks, cried at the beauty of Gaudi's work in Barcelona, traced my fingers along ancient Roman columns, sketched bridges and cathedrals and homes that told stories of human ambition and creativity. Daniel did call, about 3 months after the hearing. We met for coffee, awkward and tentative, two people trying to learn each other again. He told me he'd ended his relationship with Jessica and Marcus, not dramatically but firmly, establishing boundaries he'd never had before. He said living through the trial, seeing the evidence, understanding how thoroughly he'd been manipulated had shattered his worldview. He was in therapy, working through his own issues around family, loyalty, masculinity, all the toxic patterns he'd absorbed. I listened, shared my own journey, and we began building something small but honest. We met monthly, then bi-weekly, slowly reconstructing a relationship based on who we actually were rather than roles we were expected to play. Marcus tried to contact me twice, both times through lawyers, both times trying to negotiate further modifications to the settlement. Both times I refused. I'd gotten what I was owed, what the court had determined was fair, and I had no interest in further engagement with him. His business survived but diminished, his reputation tarnished but not destroyed. Jessica left him eventually, according to Daniel, once the money situation stabilized and she realized the lifestyle she'd signed up for wasn't materializing. I felt no satisfaction in that news, no vindictive joy. I felt nothing about Marcus at all, which was perhaps the greatest indicator of how completely I'd moved on. I graduated with my architecture degree 2 years after the settlement, at 48 years old, top of my class. Daniel attended the ceremony, sitting in the audience with Linda and her family, all of them cheering embarrassingly loud when my name was called. I stood on that stage holding my degree, looking out at the few people who truly loved me, and I felt something I'd never felt before: pride. Not pride in sacrificing for others, not pride in being useful or convenient, but pride in myself, in what I'd accomplished, in who I'd become through sheer determination and refusal to stay broken. I started my own small architectural firm, specializing in restoration and sustainable design, work that honored history while building toward the future. It was symbolic in ways I didn't fully articulate, but deeply felt. My first major project was restoring a Victorian women's refuge, a building that had housed women escaping domestic violence for over a century. Working on that project, preserving its bones while modernizing its facilities, felt like completing a circle, honoring the journey from victim to survivor to something beyond survival entirely. Now, 3 years after that devastating text, I sit in my cottage office, Archie snoring at my feet, architectural plans spread across my desk, a cup of tea steaming beside me, and I think about how that moment of absolute rejection became the catalyst for absolute transformation. Daniel and I have a relationship now, not what it was, but something more authentic, more equal. We have dinner every few weeks, talk honestly about our lives, our struggles, our growth. He's dating someone new, a social worker, who reminds me of my younger self, but with better boundaries and stronger sense of self. He brings her to meet me, nervous but hopeful, and I welcome her warmth while privately hoping she never sacrifices herself the way I did. Sometimes people ask if I regret the legal battle, if I wish I'd handled things differently, if the money was worth losing years with my son. I tell them the truth. I didn't lose years with my son. I lost years with someone who didn't truly see me as a person. Getting that money back wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming my worth, about insisting that my sacrifices and contributions had value, about refusing to be erased. And the woman I became through that fight, the woman I am now, is worth every difficult moment, every painful choice, every bridge I had to burn to stop people from crossing over to hurt me. Marcus lives his diminished life, and I genuinely don't care. Jessica moved on to some other target, and I genuinely don't care. The people who tried to erase me became footnotes in my story rather than its authors. Because that's the real revenge, isn't it? Not destruction, not bitterness, not wasting energy on people who don't deserve it. The real revenge is building a life so full, so rich, so authentically yours that the people who tried to diminish you become irrelevant. The real revenge is thriving, not despite what they did to you, but because you refuse to let what they did define you. I'm 51 now, running my own business, in the best physical and mental health of my life, surrounded by people who love me for exactly who I am, pursuing work that fulfills me in ways I'd forgotten were possible. When I look back at that text, those 4 sentences that broke my heart, I see them now as a gift, a brutal, painful gift, but a gift nonetheless. Because Daniel telling me to vanish from his life gave me permission to vanish from the life I'd been living, the identity I'd been trapped in, the version of myself that existed only to serve others. I vanished from that life completely, and in the space that created, I found myself. And that's the story I tell when people ask how I survived losing my son, how I built this life from nothing, how I went from broken and discarded to thriving and whole. I tell them I didn't survive, the old me died, and that's exactly what needed to happen. I tell them that sometimes the people who hurt us most give us the greatest gifts by forcing us to stop seeking their approval and start building our own worth. I tell them that revenge doesn't have to be destruction. It can be transformation. It can be living so fully and completely that the people who tried to diminish you can only watch in awe at what you became without them. My son told me to stop calling, to vanish from his life. So I did. I vanished from the life he knew, the mother he'd taken for granted, the woman who'd made herself small so others could feel big. And in that vanishing, in that absolute disappearance from who I'd been, I found exactly who I was meant to be all along. They wanted me gone. They got their wish. But they lost someone irreplaceable, someone who would have loved them unconditionally forever, someone who gave everything she had. And what they lost, I gained. I gained myself. And that ultimately is the greatest revenge of all.